In this video, we're going to talk about some of the additional math you have to do in this wonderful chemistry course you've taken. So the first one is, you recognize moles allows you to relate the amount of particles of something you have to how much it weighs. So what that really looks like is if you have the number of moles, you need to figure out how many grams you have. What you do is multiply by the molar mass to get there. If you're given grams and you're asked to go to moles, you do the exact opposite. You divide by the molar mass. And then once you have the number of moles of a material, you can figure out how many particles that is by multiplying by Avogadro's number. That's how many particles are in a mole of any substance. So if we're talking about atoms, it's that many atoms. If we're talking about molecules, it's that many molecules. If we're talking about formula units, which is basically like the smallest ratio of the ions in an ionic compound, you would use that number. All right? So that's that. When we're looking at percent composition, it is what you would expect it to be. It's the composition of something and representing each element by some percentage. So if we're looking for the percentage of A in a compound, AB, what we do is we multiply the molar mass of A times how many of them you have, then molar mass of B times how many of them you have, and that gets you the mass of each element respectively. Now that gives you the total mass of the compound, or your molar mass of it. So to figure out the percentage that's A, you just take the mass of that substance and divide that by the total mass times 100, because anytime you're finding the percentage of something, it means out of 100% per 100. And then lastly, we had empirical formula, which is just the lowest whole number ratio of the elements in a compound. So what you'll usually be given is either percent by mass or grams. If it's percent, just assume 100 grams, and that way you just change those numbers to grams and make it very easy to calculate moles of each element. So grams of each element to the number of moles. And then what you do is you divide by the lowest number of moles that you have, and that will establish some ratio of something to 1. So for every mole of A, you have this many moles of C, or whatever the ratio ends up working out to be. Sometimes that isn't necessarily going to give you whole numbers, though. So if you say you had 2.5 to 1, multiply everything by 2, and you'll get a ratio of 5 to 2. If it's 0.33, you multiply everything by 3. So basically, you just multiply by something, but you have to do it to all of them until you get a whole number ratio. Now, sometimes you're given a problem where you're given a molar mass and you have to determine the molecular formula. And you're given information from which you can figure out the empirical formula. Remember, empirical formula is the lowest whole number ratio of the elements in a compound. So if you figure that out, and you can figure out how much the molar mass of that empirical formula would be, compare that to the molar mass of the actual compound. So say your molar mass was 200 and your empirical formula mass was 100. Well, then you'd have a factor of 2. You know that the molecule is 2 times as big as your empirical formula would be. So then you just multiply that factor by your empirical formula, and that'll get you the molecular formula. So these are just some math things that were kind of just out there that we have to do in this course. Hope you enjoyed thoroughly.